Hey everyone, this is Julian from Invicta, and we're going to be tackling a sticky subject. Who is a samurai? So, this has come up obviously in pop culture nowadays because AC Shadows and Yasuke and the conversation whether or not he's a samurai. I myself have been grappling with this topic because we produced a true size episode on the samurai, and it just became very clear that the topic is confused. So, we've brought on an expert here who's going to be guiding us through the conversation. His name is Paul. I'll let him give a brief intro to himself, and then I will give you guys the rundown on where we're headed. So, Paul, I'll let you give your intro.
Okay. Hi, my name is Paul. I am the flared user ParallelPain on Ask Historians, and I am a graduate student at Sophia University in Tokyo, and my area of research is in Edo era Japan.
Perfect. And yes, he is going to have a lot of nuance. We'll try and get into it, but it's my job to keep us on track and moving forward. But for sure, if there's questions, he'll be around on Ask Historians to do follow ups. We'll link you guys to Ask Historians if you haven't used it before. It's a great resource. But yeah, so for this video, basically, we're going to be trying to tackle who is a samurai. To answer that question, we're going to do a broad overview of the state of Japan because we're covering about 1,000 years here. So, what is the state of Japan over time? Then the samurai and society as it tracks at a macro level. And then after that, we're going to look at samurai, specifically how they manifest in the army. And then from there, finally looking at, well, how do foreigners fit into this whole situation? And then Yasuke as a kind of prime example of everything kind of culminating into who is a samurai? Is Yasuke a samurai? So that's the broad outline. So we'll start here at the top for the state of Japan. Um, there is a timeline that you could follow. Wikipedia, whatever sources can give you a broad outline, but we've already kind of pre-digested this information into this chronology of maps. Super oversimplified, but it'll give you kind of the important high-level things to factor in. So I guess we could start here. I'll give the opening remarks, and then Paul will kind of help guide the conversation as we go along. So we're starting way, way back, 794 AD, the Heian period. This is where there is the imperial court. And what we're showing on this map, roughly these kind of outlines, is their rough area of control. In this case, the court is located kind of west central Japan. The area of control is going to be these two regions here. And then we've also added some icons, which is going to be kind of the way they mobilize their army. So in this time period, it's going to be through a system of conscription. And Paul, I'll let you add a little bit more flavor to this early period here.
Yeah. So at first, the Japanese government in the Nara and Heian period, they copied Tang China with the Chinese-style conscription army, and that's the army they used to fight the locals. They're called emishi in the east and northeast of Japan. And at this time period, the samurai had nothing to do with soldiers. Samurai at this time were servants. That's what the term means, basically.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll have a parallel track of the samurai as they evolve over time.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get back to that. But I think it's right to point out that, hey, from the start, the samurai are just starting to evolve at this point, but mostly involved in civil side of things. But then, yeah, we've put this outline in dashed because they don't yet control all of Japan. The imperial court may claim, that it is the ruler of all of Japan, but the dash line here is meant to indicate that, sometimes that's just more verbose and not the actuality on the ground. But yeah, that's roughly where we start. What happens after this is there's a period that these massive conscripted armies are no longer needed because in the late Heian period, you get into a time where it's relatively peaceful. And so what we've shown in this diagram is a switch from a conscription model into a more localized model where you start to get these mercenary or private warriors that pop up across the realm. It's cheaper and easier for the central authority to delegate, policing and other tasks to these local forces as long as they keep bringing in the tax money. So you have this during the peacetime, this increasing decentralization, All these privatized forces, though, still do report up the chain to the central authority. And there is some conflict with the northern part of Japan where they're not quite tamed, but some of the samurai up there, or at least the mercenary warriors, have a dotted line back to the crown in the sense that they're kind of loosely um, tied to them. And I don't know if you want to add any additional comments on this one.
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. At this period, because the Emishing have been quote unquote conquered more or less, and also the Tang dynasty was collapsing, so the court didn't see a need to keep these hugely expensive conscript armies, and they basically delegated the task of peacekeeping to local forces. They're like mercenaries, they're like paramilitary groups, kind of like that.
And we'll see that that is going to pose some issues soon. So, getting into the Kamakura era, and it's also important to note that all of this is really gradual and very much oversimplified. So, um, yeah, gradual. But anyways, a major shift starts to happen around the Kamakura period. This is where basically you start to have some of these local powers consolidate their rule. Uh, in this case, there's the Kamakura Bakufu, which is its own government that starts to form, or at least a power center that forms in the east. Um, and we've changed the allegiance of some of these samurai to the Bakufu. So in this period, Japan kind of gets split east and west. The court also still has some samurai that answer it, but now power is not just delegated to the low levels, but actually starting to be split. But obviously, there's still a lot of overlap between the two, where they're not clearly dividing Japan. At least is my understanding. There's still some I don't know. I don't know how you want to put it, but these guys
Right.
probably have to say they're somewhat subservient to the crown. There's lip service and all this stuff that happens.
Yes.
But yeah.
There's definitely lip service. I would even say there's actually considerable actual service. A lot of, at this point, though popular culture like to point it as just the warriors suddenly taking over completely, it's not actually the case. So the Baku, not only were they nominally under the court, at least in the early Kamakura, they actually operated fairly subserviently to the court. It wasn't later when they started trying to like get more power, sort of like that.
Okay. And the impetus for that comes in the later period for multiple reasons. To dumb it down again, there is kind of internal conflict that happens. I think you were mentioning that there is one of the Japanese emperors who I can't remember if he abdicates or he tries to make a power play. But anyways, there's some jockeying between these two, so some internal friction. Plus, you have some Mongols who are coming in, dual invasions that puts pressure, and all of this internal and external pressure kind of makes the right conditions for power to shift to the military forces because they're in a better position to respond. So I'll
Yeah,
let you maybe add
yeah, exactly.
context.
So what happened in the Jokyu War was that one of the retired emperors, he tried to run out the Hojo regents who basically took over the Kamakura Bakufu. He failed. It was completely one-sided, and after the war, the Kamakura Bakufu they basically installed a lot of their own more loyal warriors into the west as punishment against those who supported the court in the Jokyu War, and the rest of the court's warriors, when the Mongols were about to invade, the Japanese knew that they needed one command structure and they needed to mobilize as many men as they could. So the Kamakura Bakufu went to the court and said, give us control of all the rest of your warriors. And the court said, okay. And that's what happened. So that's how the Bakufu came to control all the warriors.
Nice. And that gets us into the next period where essentially, okay, you have all the warriors. Now it's pretty easily to slip into the position of kind of the ruler. So Muromachi period here, we've basically taken the Bakufu and placed it on top of the court. Um, and then all the samurai report into this kind of this combined entity, I guess you could say. But we've
Yes.
also at the same time kept dashed lines around here because uh, not everyone is really going to believe that this is the true emperor, and control is somewhat loose.
Right. So they would believe the emperor was the true emperor, but definitely they wouldn't really have as much control as before. Even the Muromachi Bakufu's control is a lot looser than the Kamakura Bakufu's, and the reason for that is there was a huge civil war between two sides, the northern side and the southern side. It's called the Nanbokcho, the northern and southern courts, where the Muromachi Bakufu forms the northern side and the court forms the southern side. And the Bakufu won eventually. But through this period, both sides needed to try to gain the loyalty of the warriors under their control. So they gave out a lot of economic and judicial rights and political rights to these warriors. So the warriors, they already had military strength. So now they became very fairly independent. They still work for the Bakufu a lot, but because of how independent they are, even after the Civil War ended, there was basically always local fighting between somebody somewhere in Japan in the time period. Yeah, that's why it's all dotted lines to connect into the center now.
Yeah, makes sense. And then soon after, you can imagine it breaks out into even further open warfare. There's a larger fighting, some emperors, maybe one, I can't remember if it's multiple, get assassinated. And now we've completely removed the dotted line because now everyone's kind of an open state of war. And that's the Sengoku Jidai, the giant civil war where everyone's going to try and make a play for total control.
Right. It wasn't the emperor that gets assassinated. It was the shogun that gets assassinated. A couple of shoguns gets assassinated in the late Muromachi and Sengoku period. Basically, one shogun gets assassinated, and that starts the downward spiral into civil war. And then another shogun gets assassinated in the middle of the Sengoku period. And it's just mayhem in the Sengoku period. And the Muromachi Bakufu in the Sengoku period actually had more control than most people think, but definitely not anywhere near enough to call on huge armies or anything like that. And there were a lot of warriors who would vie over positions, over control over the Bakufu. So you could, as a warrior, you always had a choice between who to support, and it was just chaos.
And then from that chaos, eventually, um, the lands long divided must unite, and you have the Edo period, where now we've reduced the court in size. The power structure is now centered out of Edo, later going to become Tokyo, and we have all the samurai now with straight lines, not dotted lines, connecting to this power structure. Same thing out here. We've switched it to a solid line, just widespread consolidation around the power in Edo, and this is going to last about 250 years.
Yes. And control was definitely a lot stronger in the Edo period than either the Kamakura or the Muromachi period. For example, some things that I like to compare is that around this same period is the same period in Europe where you had the rise of absolute monarchs. But the absolute monarchs in Europe were not like totalitarian rulers. There were limits to their power just because of actual limitations of what they could physically do. And in some ways, the shogun in Edo, even though he was not an absolute monarch and he never termed himself an absolute monarch because he was still under nominally the emperor, he a lot of ways had more power than the absolute monarchs of Europe. So that's how centralized things were in the Edo period.
Awesome. And yes, there's a ton more to learn about this, but that's going to have to be our high level overview to just give people a taste of the trajectory here. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to pivot to this next section, Samurai and Society, and look at each of these kind of eras and see how the samurai evolved over time. So, we'll start in the beginning, which is the Heian period, where we said, hey, court is big, it controls western part of Japan, it's modeled after China, and it has this conscription-based system, no privatized warriors yet. So at this point in time, the samurai are servants, and you were telling me that it's tied to a specific level in the court system. For now, I simplified it as mid to low level in the court hierarchy.
Yes, and that's what it was. Samurai, the word means to wait on somebody, so like a waiter. So samurai were servants, and if you look in the text of the time, whether it's something like poetry or some like the tale of Genji, you see the word samurai, or specifically before changes in pronunciation, it would be samurai and samurai, and they were servants, or they were basically people who follow princes or aristocrats around. Some of them were just servants. Other people will have been bureaucrats and scholars in the imperial hierarchy who did not attain a certain level. If I remember correctly, it was fifth rank. So fifth rank, above fifth rank, you could go up to the palace and see the emperor, receive an audience. And people below fifth rank could not. And a lot of the people below fifth rank were labeled as samurai, and there was absolutely no connection to warriors at this point.
Cool, and that gets us back to the trend that we talked about before. They disband these big armies, start to privatize these mercenaries that still, have allegiance to the central authority, but it's these privatized forces. So in this case, samurai becomes more of the name of these mercenary troops, mercenary in quotes there, because exactly what they are is subject to debate and it's kind of a little messy, but we're just saying samurais are mercenaries, and it's basically these warriors who get hired by the court to do delegated tasks. I guess maybe some of them civil, mostly having to do with law and order. I guess military, fight battles, things like that.
Yeah. So what the court now employ these warriors, and warriors directly employed by the court seem to have been referred to as samurai in this time period. And excuse me. So they usually basically, they basically hunted down criminals and captured criminals, and that's what they were paid to do. And they would also fight battles, in which case it's all criminals in the eye of the court, but if there's a rebel against the court, he would be labeled as criminal, and the samurai would go hunt him down. And yeah, that's what they did. So these were the first samurai as warriors as we know it. And yeah, so it's really interesting in that warriors in this period, not all of them were samurai, but a lot of times these warriors, they didn't really listen to the court, as I was kind of touching on, and they would only really differ from the samurai in that they were not, whether or not they were employed by the court. And a lot of these warriors actually became bandits, in effect bandits. So you would have warriors, fighting warriors, just one is officially a samurai and the other is not, and that's the only difference between them.
Got it. And yeah, so I guess the transition from here to the next one is basically the more and more you prioritize, the longer it goes on, the more these kind of uh, local powers become standardized as the means of power. Eventually, it morphs into like this warrior caste as these local people get more power. We talked about this. Um, Power grabbing goes all the way up to the point where they can control large parts of the area. We've redirected some of the lines of who's employing these guys to the bakufu. So in this case, it makes sense that there's a restructuring of the nobility and the hierarchy, and this is what slowly gets you into a more of a warrior caste system where it kind of the nobility is these warriors, they've attained power, um, but it's not universal. I guess it's very much there are still pure nobility, there are still these samurai, it depends and it varies, but increasingly it lends itself more towards this warrior case definition.
Yes. So usually I like to now refer to the nobility in the original nobility that still live in Kyoto as aristocrats, just to make things less confusing. But so originally we had these samurai as warriors who are under the aristocrats. Now, when we get into the Kamakura period, the Kamakura Bakufu basically says all the warriors under our control now are also samurai, and that basically greatly expands the meaning of samurai to include, if not all the warriors, then almost all the warriors. And it's where it becomes more of this definitely caste system, where you would have privileges granted by law that these samurai families had that the rest of the population did not.
Yeah, and at this point, once it gets more standardized, I'll mention briefly this term bushi might come up. This is way too nuanced to get into. Generally, bushi in this time is the term for professional warrior, but it gets confusing in terms of the context and who is what. But you may find that sometimes bushi and samurai are interchangeable. In other contexts, a samurai is a bushi or bushi is a samurai, but it's not always. So just wanted to throw that out there. That's a term you might run into, and they're not always the same thing.
Yes. It really, really depends on the context for that. A lot of the times they are the same thing. A lot of times they are not. It's probably best to think of it as the two terms actually define different things. So bushi comes from the term bugei no shi. So basically, gentlemen with martial pursuits. So bushi is a definition of a soldier or a person who fights. And samurai, because of the term, is a follower. So it's a servant of somebody. So they define different things, even though they can be the same person. They define different things. So that's a good way to think about it in general.
And we'll leave it there because I know you and I had to talk about it and it gets confusing. So
it gets really, really confusing.
So we'll leave it there. So, anyways, we've defined these samurai. They're coming into their own. It's a bit more formalized and standardized, and they get whatever. These are the samurai people start to get used to in popular imagination. It's a hereditary status. You're born into it, but you can also get awarded it. And so I have this little section that you had written elsewhere that I've just kind of standardized here and said, well, how do you become a samurai? What are the qualifications? So this seems to be your summary. I don't know if you want to walk through it.
Yes. So basically, a samurai was someone with enough status that he went to war armed and ready to fight. Usually he was on a horse, but in later eras, a lot of times there were foot samurais who are labeled as samurai, like the term samurai was used. So it's not always the case they were mounted, but definitely it was an expectation that if there's war, these guys are going. And the requirements at the time was basically you had enough economic power, and which meant land at the time, to support your family and hire some followers. Because if you were mounted, or even if you were not mounted, you probably need somebody to fight with you alongside you on the battlefield. You need somebody to carry food, weapons, and everything else. So that's why you need followers. So that was basically who a samurai was. He should be prepared to fight. He fought, and he had enough economic basis for followers. And a lot of time this was hereditary, but you could definitely be awarded it with it if you did enough good work, or you caught the eyes of somebody higher up. You could be awarded with samurai status.
Yeah, and what I was noticing as well is, you have this transition as people are grabbing power and there's wars and whatever. People are trying to do favors to get more people to follow them, and just ultimately people just care about who can go to war for them. And so it seems like that's kind of these three things down here, which is like, hey, you want to fight for me? Fine. You have to have the land in order to have the resources to fight, or maybe I have money and I'm going to empower you to fight on my behalf. So you have this idea of these stipends where people will pay others to like train yourself, hire your own guys, and come back to me with a fighting force. And then the last one might be, well, maybe you don't have the land, maybe you don't have the money, but you have the influence to call people to battle. So it seems like that's kind of how I'm reading this, where it starts to get a bit, they loosen it up, and it's like, hey, whoever can like bring to bear people and equipment to war, be it land, money, or influence, we'll call you a samurai.
Basically, that's what happened, especially once we get into the Sengoku period. That's what happens.
Yeah, and you had a good way of defining it. So now we're into the Sengoku era where it's just bedlam, chaos. And you had a good way of kind of summing it up on one of your Reddit threads. Was basically the definition of who is a samurai is fluid. We've talked about that.
Yeah.
Also, what's fluid is kind of checking if someone really meets the qualifications or not. And you had used the term "welcome to the team." They don't really care if you meet the qualifications, as long as you can bring bodies to the battlefield. They start to get a bit loosey-goosey with who is and is not a samurai. It doesn't matter as long as you can bring to bear, stuff for the war effort.
Yes, exactly. So it's a term that comes up. It's more later. The term itself comes up later. It's called Jisamurai, and it basically means country samurai. So these are your local strongmen who they might have been village elders. We can't say for certain, but definitely a lot of them made up their lineages, and they just said we had some this or that this really famous ancestor who was a samurai, so therefore we are samurai. And nobody was going to bother saying no, because everybody needed more people to fight for them. So definitely welcome to the team. And welcome to the team wasn't just people who wanted to be samurai. So we had these samurai who wanted to be samurai and became samurai. But there are also samurai who did not want to be samurai because they did not want to go to war. A lot of people didn't want to go to war because, well, war is terrible. But the lords on top, they said, we need people to fight. So you are samurai. And because you have these economic requirements, you are samurai, you're coming. And that's what happened. And Jisamurai is a later term. At the time, they just said samurai. They used the term samurai to refer to these people. And they would have been richer than your average peasant, but the cutoff line for a samurai was actually pretty low. It's basically nothing more than you're able to probably support your family and maybe hire a couple of servants, and that's about it. We know that one of the clans, the Yuki clan, even said, we'll lend you a horse if you're coming to war, because you can't, the lowest of the lower class samurai, like, we'll lend you a horse if you're coming to war because you can't afford it. And then the Hojo had foot samurai that they paid a certain amount, and they only had one follower. So that's, the cutoff line was really low and the term was really loose.
And then straddling the lower levels of samurai into the peasantry, you kind of have these are all non-samurai, but I've kind of put them in light red because they're still showing up to war. So it's like the Ashigaru or the Wakato type foot soldiers who start to, that's also blurry, but we would call them bushi in the sense that these are all people going to war.
Yes. So we have these soldiers, they're kind of in between a samurai and the peasants. And normally people would call them Ashigaru. At the time, Ashigaru was a more specific term that wasn't usually used this way, but let's just say Ashigaru. Sorry. And they will make up the bulk of an army, and they would be a samurai's followers, and they would be bushi. And that's what was happening. And for our purposes, this is that kind of the dividing line between a samurai and a wakato or a ashigaru wasn't always so clear. And definitely there are a lot of hints in laws or edicts issued in the Sengoku period and the later Edo period, or the early Edo period, that kind of suggest that wakato were samurai. So we have these kind of unclear definitions in this time period, but definitely it was a very chaotic and not very formalized time for the definition of the word samurai.
And then that's a good point to end on, because after this, Edo period, war is over. Now we got to try and reorganize things. So we've shown this here. There's still these samurai running around, but their allegiance is now to Edo. And now it becomes important to kind of start purging out the riffraff and more cementing power structures and preventing kind of the chaos from before. So one, there's peace. Two, there's cleaning up the peace. So we characterize this, instead of fluid, it's more formalized. Instead of saying welcome to the team, it's actually prove that you're a samurai. So they get stricter. So we have some notes here. Basically, they start to enshrine the privileges of the samurai. There's a crackdown on verification and enforcement of the privileges. But then overall, there's a romanticization of what is a samurai. What was our past like? Who do we wish we were? And then through it all, there's still some level of class mobility, more so than people would think. Even though there is this crackdown, there's still some mobility.
Yes. So the privileges of a samurai in the Edo period, and they actually came in later than most people would think, is, for example, the privilege to wear two swords. That is actually something that only happened in the later 17th century and the early 18th century. Before that, anybody could just wear swords. What happened was that the shogunate started to give out these privileges as rewards for something. And for the reward to mean something, it must be very exclusive to a certain group of people. So they started issuing laws and cracking down on people wearing swords. And people's clan names, everybody had surnames, everybody had clan names. So that's an often misconception that people have of Japanese people at the time. that only samurai had surnames. That's not true. So everybody had surnames, but only samurai were allowed to use their surname on official documentation. And that privilege actually extends very far back, but we don't know when it started because it was never written down in law until the 1800s. Early 1800s is when the first law on that came down. So that also shows us that even though there's crackdowns and there's enforcement, it wasn't always followed. So a lot of people were basically pretending to be samurai. And that's, again, why these laws were issued often repeatedly, because people weren't following them. And again, a lot of this romanticization is because now that samurai meant something, people wanted to be samurai. It wasn't a war that you had to risk your life over, but there was special privileges, special status, and special jobs for these samurai. So people wanted to be samurai. Again, despite this, there's some class mobility, definitely more than most people will realize. And not everybody could be a samurai, but if you were rich, if you were lucky, you could get adopted by a samurai even though you were not, because you knew him, you were his friend, or you worked under him and did some good job. Or if you were a rich peasant or a rich merchant and the clan was in serious need of money, you could donate a heck of a lot of money and the clan would give you samurai status. So that's what happened. So it's more formalized now, but it's still not the rigid class or caste system that most people think it is.
Yeah, so I think at that point, we basically defined Japan over the years, samurai over the years. That's mostly it as the takeaway. But now we wanted to drill down a little bit further with some specific instances. So it'll be samurai in the army. Could foreigners become samurai, and was Yasuke a samurai? Now you understand when we say samurai, this could mean anything. So more specifically, all of these points down here are going to be tied to the Sengoku era samurai, when it's kind of the blurriest.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess we'll start with samurai in the army. So the general idea here is you have this system with the daimyo at the top, this network of vassals that goes down the chain, first vassals, major vassals, minor vassals. Then these guys keep calling upon their underlings, which is essentially going to be the general population. Of those, you'll have the peasants, the ashigaru, and the rural samurai that are going to get mobilized. Here, this is just an image that's coming from our True Size episode, which you can check out, that Paul also helped us with. But basically, these are the samurai that get fielded. Samurai, like we've alluded to, you can have your rich guys who have your horse and the fancy equipment. You have your poor samurai who can just be on foot. And then you have your non-samurai, the ashigaru, who are definitely warriors, but are more lightly armed. And then the peasants who actually show up more so as like porters. So these are the guys who are coming to battle. But the way in which you come to battle is going to be through this system of mobilization that's tied to your assessed production of land, which is measured in koku. One koku is enough to feed a man for a year. It's about 150 kilograms of rice. And based off that, throughout this period, and especially later, you have these assessments of koku and an expectation that you're going to bring a set amount of men, but then also different gear that comes with them. So I know, Paul, you had done a good job synthesizing a lot of this and summarizing them. We don't have to go into great detail, but maybe I'll let you comment a little bit on this system.
Yeah, so this system was born out of the Sengoku period and a need to mobilize as many people as possible, but also standardize mobilization. Because before this system appeared, basically a vassal would just bring ever many people he wants, and the lord had no control over what kind of army he was getting. That was obviously going to be a big problem. So that's likely the reason this kind of system came into place. And right now, we have the mobilization defined by the total number of men, and then a number of different types of equipment like armor, horse, sashimono, or yari, flags and guns. And a lot of times the equipment doesn't match to the men, and that would just be because that there are men who could be equipped however much, whatever they wished, and there are men who are not expected to really be fighting. And this is the system that persists into the Edo period. Japan did not transition to a kind of more territorial or standardized regiments that the Europe transitioned into in the 16th century. And I would say that's because they never had a chance. They were kind of in the middle of this transition when war stopped. So there was never a need to transition any longer. Once we get into the Edo period, the number of men or the mobilization rates dropped so that it was less of a burden on samurai because there's no war to fight. But the general idea that people were to mobilize by their tax revenue is the same.
Yeah, and actually looking at this, one thing I'm noticing is this list starts at 100 koku, but even that, that's bringing 6 men. That's a pretty well-off samurai, right? I think you were telling me that's like already a hatamoto.
So that would be in at least in the Edo period, 100 koku for the Bakufu itself, for the Edo Bakufu itself, is kind of the borderline between whether a samurai was a hatamoto or not. And that's kind of when we can say definitely somebody with 100 koku, he's definitely a samurai. Whether he was well off, relatively speaking, compared to, I would say, probably most other bushi, is where we can use the term to differentiate. Compared to most other bushi, somebody at 100 koku was definitely more well off. However, they would not have been that well off, as in they would not have been rich. They would not have lived lavish lives simply because they could not afford it. But they were on as bushi as a whole, when taken as a whole, they were the more well off of the bushi, definitely starting from 100 koku onwards.
Yeah, and that gets us into kind of what does it look like when they deploy for battle? And this is again pulling from our episode where we tried to model this in 3D. But the idea was, I think, in our assumption in that model was, hey, your poor samurai can only really afford to bring an average of 1 to 2 guys with him, versus your average kind of more well-off samurai who can afford a horse has maybe 4 or so retainers. So I guess that was our assumption here. But how does this match with, if this is one samurai with 4 men, is the 4 part of the 6? Or is this guy having 6, 4 of which are armed, and then 2 of which are elsewhere, maybe as a porter or something else?
Yes, this is kind of unclear, but by my interpretation of the sources, definitely this 4 will be part of the 6. And whether there will have been more armed men is kind of open to interpretation, especially since it's usually the Sengoku edicts that have such high levels of mobilization, and they are kind of unclear on whether that would include porters or that all of them would be soldiers, just a few would be armed however much they want. My personal interpretation is that they will include porters, because otherwise it's a really, really high level of mobilization that would be really, really taxing, because if you don't include the porters, you will have to add another 20%, 10% at least to the army, and that's a lot of population to be mobilized. For example, 100 koku is said to feed. One koku is said to feed one man for a year, adult man for a year. So 100 koku can feed 100 men for a year, and it used to be that is how historians did population estimates. So they used to just do 100 koku means 100 people, a population of 100. It's no longer that simple, but the end result is not that far off, which means if you have 100 koku and you're mobilizing 6 men, you're mobilizing 6% of the population. That is very, very high. Usually, again, there are time periods and there are places with higher mobilization, but usually it's a lot lower than that. For example, professional armies of Europe at the time, there are exceptions, but professional armies of the time in Europe, like in Spain or in France, usually mobilize a lot less, maybe around 1%, 2% is a little bit stretching it. So that's why I would say they would include porters. The poor foot samurai, they would really only have one to two retainers. There are even cases when they had no retainers. So they were still samurai. They came to battle, but they had no retainers. That's how poor they were. So,
Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to mention for deployment in battle is you have them coming with their retainers and fighting alongside them. But then it's also the case that you have some samurai just being plucked out and assigned as officers to purely Ashigaru units.
yes.
So, yeah.
So we had them for Ashigaru units. We had them for samurai units as well. So Ashigaru units, usually they would be commanded by somebody. Kumigashira, the term often used is Ashigaru Taisho, which means literally Ashigaru commanders. And these would be samurai who they'll be mounted, they will have their followers, and they will be commanding the Ashigaru. And then there were samurai like the Kumigashira who would be commanding other samurais, like that.
Yeah, and we'll cover all that in that other episode, which you guys should check out. But to finish the thought here, basically you take all that together, and people often want to know how many samurai in an army are we talking about, and it varies. But I think you and I discussing this was basically your typical for like a big army would be anywhere from 16 to 33% are samurai, either as officers or in their own units with retainers alongside them. But it can stretch from there because once you get away from these large armies, which kind of give you a nice bell curve distribution, and you get to smaller armies, you can get some edge cases that are kind of weird. So we said, maybe a small army here might get down to 5%. If it's just one local samurai who's rallying a bunch of kind of low level Ashigaru peasants or whatever, it might just be one samurai or a couple samurai with a big pool of backing behind them. On the other hand, it could be a couple samurai who aren't able to get that many followers, but in and of themselves, they have the armor, the equipment to mobilize at, like, let's say 50% for this little battle. So the further away you get from these big armies, the more kind of edge cases you get. But really, the end story here is you never have 100% samurai armies.
Right. Yes, that's true. And that actually goes way back. Even in the Kamakura period, there's a lot of followers, so you never get 100% samurai armies.
And that's in keeping with their distribution in the population, right? I think we don't exactly know. It depends how you define a samurai, but maybe 10 to 20%. I can't remember what the estimate is.
Yeah, I would say 10 to 20% is probably a good estimate of how many samurai is in an army, depending again on the definition and the specific.
Oh, I meant in the population. Is it also 10 to 20 or is it
lower? As the general population. So general population, I would say samurai, at least the samurai family, so not the guy actually going to war, but counted as his entire family. Samurai would make up about 2 to 3% of the population, and that is basically at the end of the Edo period, the new government. So after the Tokugawa Bakufu, the Edo Bakufu collapsed, the new Meiji government had censuses, and they needed to redivide society into more quote unquote modernized. Certainly they thought it was modern, but they couldn't get completely away from the tradition. So what they did was they created a few new class structures, two of which, one is called Shizoku, and all the samurai gets put into the Shizoku. And the other is called, I believe this, so sorry, I don't remember the term for it, but basically all the Ashigaru gets put into, or Ashigaru as in non-samurai soldiers, gets put into that group instead. And going by that, samurai is about 2 to 3%, and the Ashigaru is about another 2 to 3%.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I guess
But
that makes sense.
Again, that's the family though, so that's not just a person.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, that's what happens when you have a small percentage, but that percentage is your warrior caste. They're going to be the ones who are showing up and making a proportionally much larger amounts of the army than they would otherwise be.
Yes.
Okay. And then the last thing to show here on the army is just a little bit of a teaser for that other episode where we show the model of a 50 key sonae, which is basically the sonae is the tactical group of the Japanese army. You kind of repeat these over time, and they're typically going to be like a mixed composition force. 50 key meaning basically 50 cavalrymen. So here we're showing the makeup of this group. So that you have the 50 cavalrymen over here. Each of those cavalry then brings with them 4 retainers. Then you have, the foot samurai. And then over here is going to be the Ashigaru. And then you have I believe it's the command, the banner, and then the baggage. So this is just a quick preview of the way we modeled things and how it might look like manifesting in war. And again, the numbers came out roughly to about 13% samurai, and most of them being Ashigaru doing the fighting.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So that gets us quite far along. And now I wanted to cover the last kind of major topic here is how do foreigners fit into this equation? And then from that, we'll get into Yasuke. But let's talk real briefly about just foreigners in general. So my understanding is we have this structure that we defined before, which is, the daimyo, all his vassals that then tap into the general population. And well, basically I was thinking, well, you take any of these foreigners, and as long as they can establish a relationship to the daimyo or maybe some other major lord, essentially they're in the club now. And as we said before, who is or is not a samurai in this period becomes quite loose. So as long as you can get this personal relationship, you can become a samurai. And so we have different instances here. Noted, Hatamoto, advisor, merchant, even an artisan. I think you had an example. Are all people who had become samurai, if not maybe bushi.
Yeah, if not bushi. The artisan, we could argue whether or not he's a samurai. He was a bushi, but we could argue whether or not he's a samurai. But definitely, you could become a samurai even if you were a foreigner, as long as you catch the eye of the Lord through something. For example, William Adams, the basis for the main character show in Shogun, he didn't really fight. He was a diplomatic advisor and a merchant. And there were other people like him who became samurai in this way. They received a stipend, and most of them had big clans and passed down their clan names and passed down the family because they remained in Japan and stayed. So their family stayed on with their fiefs or their stipends, and they just become samurai. As long as they did something to catch the Lord's eye they could become samurai.
Yes, and one note, I saw someone had asked you this on Ask Historians was there an official samurai-ification ceremony, like a knighting or whatever? And I think your short answer was basically no. There's not really a formal process for it.
Yeah,
There are
basically.
some there are some telltale
Mhm.
signs that they did catch the noble's eye, but there's no official,
Yeah.
ceremony.
So I am not that well versed in European history, but it is my image. The image that I have of a knighting ceremony is like the one that you see in paintings where the young man kneels down and then his lord or something taps him on the shoulder with his sword, and now he's a knight. And people with the official designation of knight is actually fairly rare in Europe. I think it's well under 1% of the population. Well under 1%. Not even just of the population, but of a mobilized army. For samurai, there's no real such thing as kind of a samuraiing ceremony. They are basically two rough equivalents. One is coming of age ceremony for a young man from a samurai family, or really from any family, but in this case from a samurai family who comes of age and he receives his former adult name, and then he's a samurai. So basically, if you were coming of age, you lived to adulthood in a samurai family, you were a samurai. And for the other case, it wasn't really even a ceremony. If you could get a document, and these were one of the most common documents of the period, is where the Lord says, "We will confer upon you, or we will recognize your possession of a piece of estate, like however many koku, or however it was worth, of land or stipend." And that's all there is. So the document doesn't even say this makes you a samurai. It just says this is your land. And that is basically the mark of a samurai. That's all there is to it, really.
Yes, although we will say that just because you don't have that paper doesn't mean you're not a samurai, because we've shown that there's
Yeah,
a whole bunch of
definitely.
other ways. But
Definitely.
that's one of them that, like, if you have that, then you're probably a samurai. But it's not exclusively that.
Yes.
And that's a good segue actually to Yasuke. So this is the one that's causing a bit of a stir on the internet, and it's what prompted me to start kind of this episode. We've covered it more broadly, but now this is a good use case to kind of answer some specific questions. So broadly, who is Yasuke? So he's um, an individual who came from Mozambique, came to India, to then Japan. I think through a chain of custody through the Jesuits. I'm not actually super familiar with his story, but I think the Jesuits are what shuffled him ultimately into Japan. And then essentially from there, then he passes to the Japanese, Oda Nobunaga, and then eventually his son, for a brief period. So I think that's broadly the story. And a lot of people have asked, well, in this chain, did he ever really become a samurai? And so I guess I'll open the floor to you to maybe answer that. And I've pulled out some of your other responses that you've prepared previously.
Yes. So was Yasuke a samurai? Yes. There's really no other way to put it. And that is keeping in mind of the term samurai was really a lot looser than most people would realize in this time period, or really in any time period. But Yasuke, we know, as far as we know from the sources, when he was presented to Nobunaga, he was given a stipend. So like I said, like if you were recorded in a historical source of receiving a stipend or a piece of land, that is telltale sign that you were a samurai. So this is a very important sign that Yasuke was probably a samurai. And then the source
And
also said,
and
sorry,
just to hold you there, because I know there was some contention on Reddit. If did he? Yes, he received a stipend, but maybe there's other stipends that aren't having to do with samurai. because they're
Oh
different
yes.
classifications. And you went
Yes.
into that pretty thoroughly. We don't have to cover all of it, but basically you confirmed that every time the author uses this specific type of stipend, he's always referring to it with samurai. So when he mentions this stipend and Yasuke, it's in the same category as these other 8 occasions.
Yes. So the author of the Shinchōkōki, which is the Japanese chronicle that has samurai in it. The chronicle itself centers around Nobunaga. It uses the word fuchi, which is a type of stipend that it's not exclusively samurai, but there are other cases where it's used for other people. But in the Shinchōkōki, is only used for samurai, and even in other cases, the vast majority of people who received fuchi were samurai. And it's really interesting because it's kind of built into the word itself, because the way that fuchi, this type of stipend, is calculated, even though it's paid out in rice usually, it's actually calculated in people, and you can see it in the passages in the Shinchōkōki as well. And it's calculated in people because it's supposed to be the part of the samurai's wage that he uses to hire his helpers. You could almost think of it as a business reimbursement, like business expense reimbursement, except that other samurai who are not on fuchi are also supposed to pay their expenses out of pocket. So there's not really a difference in that way. But this stipend fuchi, because it's supposed to be used for hiring helpers, it's definitely telltale signs that whoever received this was a samurai.
Okay, and that's just one of the multiple kind of indications that he was a samurai. So first a stipend, and then you mentioned some other. He carried Nobunaga's weapons, which is not something you give to just about anyone. He fought with a katana, and he was mobilized and actually took part in campaigns. So there's a lot of different indications that
Yes.
would point in the same direction.
Yes. For example, he carried Nobunaga's weapons. Weapon carriers, they were weapon carriers who were not samurai, but in these cases, these were for the weapon carriers of smaller samurais. Somebody as important as Oda Nobunaga's weapon carriers at the time were most definitely samurai. For example, it's actually in the Edo period. After the Edo period, they interviewed people who used to work in the Edo Bakufu, and they asked them about who carried the shogun's weapon, and the shogun's weapons were carried by samurai. And the very year that Nobunaga met Yasuke, I think actually just a few days or just a few weeks after he met Yasuke, Nobunaga actually holds this huge parade in Kyoto. And because he held this huge parade, we have records in the Shinchōkōki about who carried Nobunaga's weapons at that parade. And the people who carried Nobunaga's weapons in the parade were samurai. So the records we have of weapon carriers for somebody this important were samurai. So if Yasuke was carrying Nobunaga's weapons, he was most likely a samurai. And when he went into the Takeda campaign with Nobunaga the next year in 1582, he didn't do any fighting because the campaign was basically over by the time Nobunaga entered enemy territories himself. Like all his other separate army took care of the Takeda, and Nobunaga just kind of organized the political aftermath of the campaign, and Yasuke was by his side. Yasuke, it was recorded in one of Tokugawa Ieyasu's followers' diary. His name is Matsudaira Ietada. And Matsudaira Ietada recorded Yasuke, this black person who was called Yasuke, who had fuchi or stipend from Nobunaga. And what's interesting is the date he recorded it is a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember exactly off my head, but definitely after. Nobunaga is recorded in the Shinchōkōki of issuing an order for his army to dismiss all their lower soldiers, let all their soldiers go home because the war is basically over, and only the unit commanders, we're told, or his koshos and his bodyguards are with him. So all the normal soldiers were sent home, and only these important samurai were with Nobunaga at the time. And it's after that order that Yasuke is recorded in Masaya Ietada's diary. So that also suggests that Yasuke was not just a normal soldier. He was somebody who's important enough to still be by Nobunaga's side. And also, we know he fought, and we fought with the katana. At least that's what the Jesuits recorded, that he fought with the katana at Nijo Castle or Nijo Palace after Nobunaga was assassinated. And that's also shows us that he was most likely samurai. There are some people who posts on Reddit asking me, why wasn't there a specific document that says Yasuke was a samurai? The problem with that kind of thinking is that most samurai did not have such a documentation because it was never thought of as needed or really meaningful, because what was meaningful was what the person did and what his economic background was, how many people he could mobilize, that kind of thing. So we don't have documents on most samurai that says you are a samurai.
Yeah, and you were telling me you ran into some other people who were just, raising some other objections, which is, well, if you're a samurai, you're supposed to get this clan name. But you were saying, well, maybe in the case of foreigners, it's not always applicable because, well, sometimes these foreigners just aren't given a fief, as was the case with Yasuke. He had no famous ancestors known to the Japanese, and he was probably not high ranking enough to get Nobunaga's name. So
Yeah.
there's a bunch of these cases, and you said this parallels very closely to another known samurai who was a foreigner who also didn't get a clan name. So just saying that these, it just happens to other
Yes.
people as well.
Yes. So clan name, there's not, at least not as far as I could find, and not that my professor know of, that specifically said a samurai must have a clan name. That does not mean that such a rule did not exist, because some rules were by tradition, but it does mean it was never formalized. And the likely reason is because it was never thought of as necessary, because a clan name's purpose, besides identification, was either to tie the samurai to his fief or his estate, which, as far as we know, Yasuke did not have one. It was to tie the samurai to a famous ancestor, which Yasuke definitely did not have one, at least in the eyes of the Japanese people. He could have been given a clan name by his lord, but to tie them together, some offshoot of the Oda, or like a related clan name to one of the ranking vassals. If it was not recorded, and really Yasuke probably was not high enough in rank to justify that kind of reward. And like I said, we do have a similar example in the person of Jan Josten van Lodenstein. I hope I am not butchering the Dutch pronunciation. So Jan Josten, or Lodenstein, he was the Dutch counterpart to William Adams. They shipwrecked onto Japan on the same ship. And he also became kind of a diplomatic consultant, and merchant to Tokugawa Ieyasu. And we know he had a 5. And depending on the historical source, his 5 was either 100 koku or 1,000 koku. And either way, that will make him a samurai. And he did not have a clan name. We know that he did not have a clan name because his entire Japanese name, which is Yayose, was often written in the historical sources completely in hiragana. So that's not something you would do for a proper clan name, which is supposed to be kanji, which is Chinese characters. So if Lodenstein's name was completely in hiragana, that strongly suggests the complete name was his first name. So he did not have a clan name either, despite it being he being possibly a very high status Hatamoto, but definitely a very important samurai. For Lodenstein, a likely reason he did not have one is because he always wanted to go home, and he actually died on the way home to Europe, and that's likely why he never saw a need to take up the clan name of wherever his 5 was, which is what William Adams did. William Adams went by Miura because that's where his 5 was, and Lodenstein did not do that, likely because he always wanted to go home and he did not really plan on passing his 5 down. Because we have this example, and because there's no law that says samurai needed to have clan name, there's really no problem with Yasuke being an exception of the time and just not using a clan name. And we really have no reason to think Yasuke had one, and we have no reason to think it was a problem.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the depth of your response for the Yasuke story, and that's what drew me to you. Pulling you on as a researcher for our episode and for this kind of interview, lecture, whatever you want to call this today. So I just want to say I really appreciate you helping us, and I really think you've helped audiences. I hope people will let you know in the comments below. And again, if anyone has questions for follow ups, I would direct them over to Ask Historians. It's a great resource. And stay tuned on the channel where we're hoping to have Paul contribute to more content. Maybe if there's more topics that deserve a deep dive like this, we can do that. But I think that's basically it. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, Paul, before we end it.
Nothing much. Just thank you for having me, and I hope this clears up a lot of misconceptions and offer a lot more background and deep understanding of what makes up a samurai and what things were like in Japanese history.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.